And James, thank you for being here today, here at the FPA at Concordia. It's an incredible affair here, some terrific summits. I really want to delve right into some of the questions too, because having an expert like you who've seen several administrations coming from the commerce and trade side, economics, it's the topic, not so much today's summit, but certainly on all of our minds. Where do you think we were back in the day when you were serving in these illustrious positions, and where are we now? What's the difference?
Well, first of all, you have to realize that I was very much responsible for helping to negotiate many of the trade agreements that we're now trying to overturn. And so it makes for an interesting situation. Just to give you an idea, of course, the United States is so immersed right now in a trade battle with China. When I was in government, I was the host for one of the very first Chinese delegations that ever came to Washington. It was headed up by the Mayor of Shanghai. This was so long ago that everybody walked into the room and they were all wearing Mao Zedong suits. And so in those days, we were selling the Chinese $4 billion, they were selling us $4 billion, and we actually had a surplus of about $7 million. As of this year, at the end of June, which is only 6 months, half a year, we were actually selling the Chinese $52 billion. They sold us $220 billion. So you can see how dramatically the picture has changed. And so, I think that the world, not just China and the United States, have to be concerned about how all this is going to come out in the wash, because it's going to have an effect not only on the parties concerned, but it's going to have a ripple effect around the globe.
What would you say are the three salient points that any layperson doesn't understand when they're jumping in on either side of this debate?
Well, one concern always is intellectual property, meaning if we invent something, for example, if you take a medication that has taken a pharmaceutical years and millions of dollars to be able to produce, you can have competitors overseas take that same medication in 24 hours, they'll know exactly what's in there. And so they haven't had to spend the money, but all of a sudden they start producing it. That's counterfeit. That is a way to be able to get advantage without having to pay the piper at the end of the day. That's one concern. Another one is when you get into currency manipulation. You try to figure out exactly what something's going to cost, and then you try to use your currency to be able to figure out a way that you can benefit and the consumer is not going to benefit. And then finally, it gets down to a matter of exactly what the tariffs are going to be, which is nothing more than a tax. And it gets very difficult when there are certain things made, for example, here in the United States, but you need parts that you can only get from China. So you have to take that into consideration. They're more expensive, and then that raises the price of the domestic produced product. So there are a lot of issues, and unfortunately the consumers have to be in the middle of it and have to pay the price.
Ultimately, do you think that's who it's going to shift to, that the costs will be adjusted back to the American side of the consumer?
I think it will. I think for the time being, we're going to see this can kick down the road. I think the United States and President Trump in particular is going to be thinking about November 2020. I'm not sure what's happening in November 2020, but I think it's going to be kicked down beyond that, and we'll try to keep the lid on. It's a little bit like watching a pot on the stove with a top on, and it's bubbling and bubbling and bubbling, and I think it's going to stay there. But after that election, I think that burner is going to go way up, and we're going to see the pot boil.
Well, you're talking about the election, and one of the things, obviously, economy is a key buzzword in that, especially now. But there's also always another buzzword, and that's religion and where everybody falls. And you even were willing to delve into this via a book and a PBC series there. Talk about this, religion coming into the election.
Well, this was a different chapter in my life, but it was great fun. I wanted to be able to have a sense of what Americans have gone throughout their history, and believing that prayer is the most private, innermost thoughts of individuals, it became a great way to really kind of gauge American history. So I started with early Native America, and I went all the way to the modern day. It was in chronological order, and my publisher was Doubleday, one of the great names in publishing. And then I turned to Random House and I said, hey, how about doing the audio? They said, we'd love to do it. So I got some friends and acquaintances to help me out. So the voice of Stonewall Jackson and George Patton was John McCain. Then I got the voice of the slaves to be Ben Vereen, who became very famous on television, and quite a few individuals like that, and it was a great experience. And so I went on a couple of national tours, and we launched the whole thing before 2,000 people, 200 Americans coming together to be able to show how they prayed and their traditions. And I was the host for the evening, and it was held at the Washington National Cathedral. So you couldn't have had a better place to have launched all this. And then, as you were mentioning, it turned into a BBC, PBS miniseries. And then we put together a wonderful program that went into middle and high schools. So it was a 5-part series where they were able to learn about the history of prayer in America. So it's been great fun, and as I said, that was a different chapter in my life, and 2 other books came out of it. And but I'm thrilled, and it's meant an awful lot, I know, to a lot of people.
So much what we think about of this country is that it has been a bastion of religious freedom, and when one digs into it, it's somewhat questionable when you look at the Flushing Remonstrance and early stages of early Manhattan.
Absolutely, and I think it's so important. My book came out a few years after 9/11. And it was very important for me to make sure that it was inclusive even of Muslims. And I found, fortunately, a wonderful prayer that was written by a teenage Muslim girl in Los Angeles, which she wrote to be able to commemorate what happened on 9/11 and to show that we're all one human family. And that sort of thing, I think, helps along the way, and I was just thrilled to be a part of it.
Well, there's the classic question, do politics and religion mix? So I put that to you.
It depends which politician you're talking about, but I think it's awfully important to realize that we're all subject to a higher power. When you know that the President of the United States truly has religion, for example, you know that he or she is not going to be believing that they are the Almighty, but rather somebody else they're going to have to answer to at least someday in their lives. So.
And conversely, do economics and politics mix?
The answer is no, but they do mix all the time, and so we have to be ready for that and understand what the repercussions are. My concern always is that we don't learn the lessons from history, and if we just would take the time to be able to think back what happened in the past, I think we would be able to avoid the mistakes of the future. But I'm afraid every generation has got to learn it on their own.
Well, James, you certainly have that perspective, and I thank you for sharing that with us here at Concordia at the FPA.
My great pleasure.
Thank you.